issues that our country is facing.
Does this mandate make sense?
That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil, contextualized conversation with perspective.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
This is big criminal exposure for the president if, in fact, an indictment is filed.
Will he be on the debate stage in a month?
Yeah, we have every confidence he'll make that debate stage.
Extremists pass book bans to prevent them from learning our true history.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump is facing a possible indictment in the January 6th investigation. The grand jury met today here in Washington. CBS News has learned the special counsel's office cited 3 federal statutes in its target letter to Trump. Possible charges against the former president include conspiracy to commit an offense or to defraud the government or to defraud the United States. He has also called the inquiry a witch hunt. CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa joins us now. Bob, good to see you. Thanks for being here. I know you've covered all of these investigations looming and to come. Give us a sense of what the scope of this particular investigation is. What exactly has Special Counsel Jack Smith been looking at in this case?
How much time do we have? I mean, this is so sprawling, Caitlin. Talking to people close to this investigation who have participated in different ways, to leave it at that. Let's say for sourcing reasons, people were very familiar with how this is playing out. Think of this as a multi-front investigation. Whereas the classified records investigation of Trump is really about his conduct. It's about Mar-a-Lago. It's about documents he took back to his property. This is about so many different pressure points Trump was using to try to stay in power. And what we hear is that the special counsel is building a really sweeping case. What was he doing with the vice president, Mike Pence? And you spoke to one of his top aides today. What was he doing with the Justice Department? What about members of Congress? What about Republicans in the states? All of these levers of power Trump was pulling. And the question the special counsel is trying to answer is, did the then president of the United States have criminal intent to use the government's means or to use people to stay in power? And did he conspire? Did he have a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States? Now, why do I use the word fraud? Because that's at the crux here of what they're looking at. Was Trump told, which we know he was, by many of his lawyers, that if you repeat these claims about the election that are false and still move forward under the guise that this is accurate, you're at risk of being accused of committing fraud against the United States? Very serious.
Very serious indeed, and I'm glad that you laid it out that way, because I think when people are learning about a new indictment or the investigations continuing, and of course they're still interviewing some people here, it can be kind of confusing about what exactly we're looking at. And I've noticed, talking to Republican primary voters and potential caucus goers, that they are also kind of echoing Trump's language that this is political. And I'm curious, in your reporting, how the Trump campaign is responding, but also if what you make of the idea that this could provide an opening for Trump's rivals to go after him, and yet they are pretty tepid in trying and criticizing him on this issue. They've also been echoing his rhetoric on this as well. Why do you think that is?
Well, there is a jarring disconnect between the consequences Trump is facing legally and the consequences Trump is facing politically. He's facing very serious charges already on classified documents, and potentially here, criminal conspiracy against the United States to commit fraud, all of these other charges that are looming here on January 6th. It could put Trump potentially in prison. It could be a protracted legal process. But politically, his advisors tell me and others that they don't feel much political heat, because the voters, as you say, you've met with them in Iowa recently, in New Hampshire, they believe Trump's in the right, that he's a victim of some kind of establishment legally and politically, and they're not necessarily on the edge of their seats wondering which the next tidbit of information that's going to drop on Trump's conduct. They've internalized so much about Trump's behavior, about how he operated as president, that they're not alarmed by any new development. And so many of his rivals, as we see, are not really willing to take him on. Though it's interesting that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, you heard, he was raising some questions about whether Trump was too idle on January 6th, not doing much on the day of the Capitol attack. That's interesting. It's a crack, but not necessarily a yawning gap.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because he also was trying to make the point of, we need to move on. We don't need to look back. I'm the candidate that can look forward. And so you're right that there are kind of these subtle ways to talk to voters. But as long as they are agreeing with Trump in terms of how they perceive these investigations, remains to be seen.
It reminds me of how the Republicans historically handled Watergate. After Watergate happened and Nixon resigns in '74, no one really wanted to talk about it anymore. You didn't hear Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford talk about Watergate a lot in 1976 when they were running. It was just something Republicans wanted to put on the shelf. Same with Bill Clinton's scandals in the 90s. You didn't hear Democrats want to talk about them ad nauseum. And so politically, there's always an inclination to kind of move on, shoulder what has happened. Yeah, and make this a contrast with the current president. On that note, I want you to stick around because we have some developments going on Capitol Hill. I want to bring in Nicole Killian because U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it's a familiar name, testified on Capitol Hill Thursday. He addressed lawmakers on the Republican-led Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. His testimony comes as he faces backlash over his recent anti-Semitic remarks. Multiple Democratic lawmakers had previously urged their Republican colleagues to rescind the invitation for him to testify. So let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian to discuss what happened today. Nicole, I want to play for you just two quick sound bites that we heard from a Democrat and a Republican.
It's why Mr. Kennedy is running for president. It's to help us expose and stop what's going on.
They intentionally chose to elevate this rhetoric to give these harmful, dangerous views a platform in the halls of the United States Congress. That's endorsing.
So, Nicole, you can tell by the questioning there, the opening statements from these lawmakers, that they were on two very different sides on this issue. Why exactly was RFK Jr. on Capitol Hill today? What were they hoping to get from him?
Well, this was part of a broader hearing around the issue of censorship, with many House Republicans on this panel alleging that they feel that the Biden administration and the federal government has been censoring Americans in various forms, and particularly when it comes to social media. And keep in mind that Robert Kennedy wasn't the only witness on this panel, that there was also a conservative journalist who wrote about the Hunter Biden laptop story. There was also the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of Louisiana, who was a witness as well, who's part of this Biden versus Missouri case recently that challenged the Biden administration's communications with social media companies when it comes to misinformation with respect to the vaccine. But obviously a lot of the attention was on Robert Kennedy, for the Kennedy name, and for some of these recent controversial comments that he made just days ago, where he suggested that COVID was genetically engineered to ethnically target African Americans and Caucasians, and that Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people were being spared, and that they're immune to it. And of course, that sparked off a wave of outrage here on Capitol Hill, which is why many Democrats wanted that invitation rescinded to him. In fact, they even tried to stop him from testifying today by trying to go into executive session, which their motion to do that was denied. So really, Democrats spent the better part of this hearing really trying to challenge Kennedy on his remarks, and not just that he made recently, but other controversial statements. He contended that, his comments were being misconstrued, that he is being smeared with labels, that he's an anti-vaxxer, that he is racist, and said that he simply isn't, that he's not anti-Semitic, that it's important to have free speech, and that, these were just labels being put on him to censor him, in effect.
And Bob, I mean, Nicole mentions that this hearing was planned before he made these comments. But, you know, it seems like Republicans are trying to elevate RFK Jr. as as he's challenging President Biden. What do you make of the campaign so far? Are Democrats taking him seriously at all, or is the strategy just to kind of ignore him?
In 1964, Robert F. Kennedy gave a famous speech at the Democratic National Convention where he quoted Robert Frost when talking about his then slain brother, John F. Kennedy. And the Frost line is about how I still have miles to go before I sleep. I have promises to keep. It's a famous speech. The place was enraptured by RFK being up there on the stage. What did Joe Biden name one of his books, title one of his books? Promises to Keep. When you walk into the Oval Office today, what do you see when you walk in? A bust of Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy, who was killed in 1968, had a million people show up for his funeral train from New York to Washington, remains this iconic figure who vibrated passion for democracy, human rights, and he is someone who has remained a hero to Democrats and some Republicans and independents in the American consciousness. And because of that, Republicans see someone who really is a shadow, the legacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s father over the current president, who sees himself as a Kennedy-style Democrat. And so they're happy to have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to testify because he brings up this division they want to exacerbate inside of the Democratic Party, though RFK Jr.'s campaign isn't getting much traction. It's being managed by Dennis Kucinich, the former congressman. But for now, it's more of an outsider run.
Yeah, and you saw him sitting behind him there at that hearing as well. We will pay attention to what comes of that. But Bob Costa, Nicole Killian, great to have you both on this. We thank you for your reporting. And former Vice President Mike Pence is one of several Republican candidates trying to qualify for the first Republican primary debate in August. Next, we'll ask his former chief of staff if Pence will be on that stage. You're streaming America Decides.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology. So advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battery ramps.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast. Streaming on CBS News. An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
I'm running for president because I think this country's in a lot of trouble. I think President Joe Biden has weakened America at home and abroad.
Welcome back to America Decides. Mike Pence is still looking to break through the crowded Republican Party field. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump, his former boss, maintains a commanding lead as he faces a possible indictment in the January 6th investigation. Earlier, I spoke with Mark Short, who's an advisor to Pence and who also served as his chief of staff while he was vice president. Great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for having me.
I want to start off with this target letter that Donald Trump has received from the Department of Justice. You also testified in front of the grand jury in this case. What do you make of this case and him being apparently receiving this target letter?
Well, I'm not sure that many of us know what to make of it until we actually get to see the expected indictment. And then I think we'll have a much clearer view. I did testify under compulsion of subpoena, but that was a long time ago, and there's been a lot of witnesses since then, and probably, Caitlin, a lot of witnesses that candidly were a lot closer to Donald Trump to that process. People like Mark Meadows, who were advising throughout the process. Keep in mind that for the vice president in that last month, he was still leading the coronavirus task force, was traveling the country trying to encourage businesses to reopen, governments and state governments to reopen. We were doing a lot of efforts in trying to secure that Senate seat in Georgia. And so I think that the vice president knew what his responsibilities were on January 6th. And so we weren't really involved in a lot of the conversations that were happening amongst some of the outside lawyers that President Trump brought in to, I think, give him pretty bad advice.
Do you think there is a political liability for the president when it comes to this case? I mean, we've seen with the previous two indictments that people in the Republican Party have rallied around him. He continues to be the front runner for the nomination. Do you think that that has any possibility of changing?
I think that it does, but I don't think there's any doubt that so far the first couple of indictments have rallied Republican voters around President Trump. I think looking ahead into the January 6th potential indictment, I do think it's a little bit different because in this case, I don't think people relish revisiting that day and seeing the videos of what happened that day again, and reminded candidly of the president's dereliction of duty on that day.
So that's really interesting to me because you would imagine that given what you just described, all of the other candidates running for the nomination against Trump would see this as an opening. But we really haven't seen candidates take this head on besides a Chris Christie or an Asa Hutchinson who have kind of, formed their campaigns around this contrast to Trump. But, even Mike Pence has said that, he'll be held accountable for what happened that day, but he doesn't think there was a criminal charge here or that he did anything criminal illegal. Why aren't candidates kind of seizing on this to try to take him down?
I probably would differ that a little bit. If you go back to Mike Pence's announcement speech on June 7th in Iowa, he addressed this very specifically and talked about his disagreement with President Trump on the day and how President Trump was wrong and how, by God's grace, he believes that what he did that day was exactly right. So I don't think he's running away from this conversation. He's actually addressed it head on. At the same time, to your point, I think he said, ultimately, I think we need to take our message to the American people, let the American people decide, as opposed to, I think, candidly, a lot of Republican voters do believe there's a two-tiered system of justice today and have a lot of skepticism about the Justice Department and which of the cases are politically motivated. And so rather than bringing a case against the president, believing that should be left to the American voters. But again, that is said, not yet seeing the indictment. And I think for many of us, we also felt that the previous indictment was politically motivated against the president on the documents. But then when you actually read the indictment, it's pretty hard to justify many of the actions of him and his team in the way that they were obstructing that investigation.
I mean, is that why we're seeing candidates kind of be reluctant to take on Trump in this regard because of what Republican voters are essentially saying that they agree with the president?
Well, I think actually Republican voters are more incentivized. They just want to talk about it anymore. They don't want to talk about January 6th. They want to be talking about, what are you going to do for me in the future? What are you going to be doing to help me? And they look at Donald Trump as somebody who came to their cause in 2016 to 2020 when he served as president and fought for many of the beliefs that they have. And so I think there is a sense of wanting to rally around him when they perceive he's in trouble. But how long that lasts and how many more indictments must he endure to continue to get that sort of support, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anybody does.
So for Mike Pence, I mean, that also, voters are, in Iowa, as you saw, he took a question from a voter who wanted him to behave differently that day. He's had to engage on this issue over and over again. What is the path forward? Do you imagine that this remains a liability for Pence insofar as we're seeing this rallying around the former president?
Well, I'd like to think that when you uphold your oath to the Constitution, it's not really a liability. And I think that that is something that will always be a part of his legacy. But as I just mentioned, I also think voters are forward-looking. And that's why I think you've heard Mike Pence talk about, I'm proud of what our record was for those 4 years. My concern is that actually Donald Trump has drifted from that record, whether or not it's on the issue of life. And now, basically saying because of him, we basically have a negotiation table to decide which children get to live and which ones don't. He's basically walked away from entitlement spending and said, we're going to leave everything as it is, which I think will bankrupt the United States. I think there are great concerns about foreign policy, his embrace of Vladimir Putin and calling him a genius for invading Ukraine. And so I think that where Mike Pence will go is to say, I'm proud of the 4 years. My worry is that Donald Trump has actually drifted away from conservatism since the administration ended.
We have seen polling where the former vice president is polling pretty low. He hasn't reached the donor requirement yet to make the debate stage. Will he be on the debate stage in a month? Yeah, we have every confidence he'll make that debate stage. I think that for the nonprofit organization he launched, he has 130 to 140,000 donors. So some of that takes a little bit of time to transition those donors to say, here's the new cause we want you to support. But I think that Mike Pence has continued to get a lot of support from traditional conservatives. And so, yeah, we have every expectation he'll be there on August 23rd. And what evidence have you all seen on the ground in a place like Iowa that there is an appetite for this? Because when we see in polling and talking to voters, there isn't this pull towards Pence. I mean, he doesn't appear to be gaining traction. How do you make that up, and how do you see it? Well, I think that he's going to continue to take his case to traditional Republican voters. And I think that there's a lot that's still at play right now, Caitlin. I don't think any of us knows what's going to happen to Donald Trump over the course of this race. And I think that, going back to where we've been before in Iowa, whether or not it was Rick Santorum winning Iowa or Mike Huckabee, in the summer they were polling at 2%, 3%, 4% before they actually gained traction and won. Even Barack Obama was in the same place, honestly, when he ran against Hillary Clinton. And people forget, Donald Trump didn't win Iowa in 2016. Ted Cruz did. So I think that there's a lot still at play, and I do think it will really begin as we sort of get into this debate season. But for a former vice president, it's very different from someone who isn't as well known. He's very well known among Republicans. Sure. I don't think you've had a scenario where you've had a former vice president running against the former president in probably about 150 years, when at that time you actually had candidates who the United States would take the top two choices and put the number two, so they didn't run as a ticket. So this is pretty unprecedented territory for all of us. All right, Mark Short, thank you so much. We'll continue to follow the campaign over the coming months.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, and fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens. Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
she dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman.
Thank you for joining us on Person to Person.
Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job? I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden delivered remarks at the Philadelphia shipyard Thursday on the many ways he says his administration is delivering on its economic plan. The president touched on clean energy and continuing to create products made in America during his speech. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us now from the White House. Ed, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So we've seen the president go out and tout what his administration sees as accomplishments and things they have done to help the economy. But behind the scenes, where do things stand with his re-election campaign? Does he have much of a campaign at this point?
It is beginning to build out, Caitlin. Good to see you this week. They hired 3 more people that will be responsible for helping raise all the money that's necessary. They believe they'll have to spend north of $1 billion to get him reelected. They also announced plans to open a reelection headquarters in his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, much to the chagrin, privately and even to some extent publicly, of some of those who may eventually have to work out of those offices, who were rooting for somewhere here in the D.C. area or perhaps Philadelphia, which at least has more dining options. But beyond that, they're essentially monitoring from the sidelines what continues to go on the Republican side and marveling at the fact that certain lawmakers and candidates say or do certain things that they then quickly exploit. I think this week the best example of that was Marjorie Taylor Greene calling out some of the work that the president had done and comparing him to FDR and LBJ in terms of the expanse of the work they're trying to do in the social program space, especially. The Biden campaign took that, popped it right onto Twitter as if she was narrating his accomplishments to those that were watching it, and it's proven to be a very popular and lucrative piece of social media for the campaign, essentially using her words against her and the Republican Party. The event today in Philadelphia, he's made more than a dozen visits there as president. This time it was to the shipyard. They're building a ship that's going to transport parts for wind farms out into the ocean, and it's being built there at a shipyard with, of course, union workers. So the president eager to say that kind of work is being done because of what we've passed. It's creating jobs, and it's going to lead to, ultimately, he hopes, at least a better climate. So these kinds of official events that allow him to tweak and irk Republicans from behind the trappings of the presidency are the kinds of events you'll continue to see no matter what the Republicans are up to.
Ed, I know you and I have both spent a lot of time in Wilmington and have exhausted most of those restaurant options, though they are very good.
Ones,
so they are very good. I want to ask about Vice President Kamala Harris, because having spent some time with Republicans, a lot of the candidates, invoke her, saying, especially Nikki Haley does this a lot, saying that if you vote for Biden, you're essentially voting for President Kamala Harris. So they're trying to use her as kind of a punching bag or a weapon of sorts. But I'm curious how the Biden campaign may be deploying her. I know she was in Indianapolis today. What did she say there? And are they seeing her as someone who can bring in new voters, or at least keep some voters for Democrats?
Let's make sure to allow people to see what she had to say. Starting a series of visits to major national conferences of sororities, civil rights organizations, gun control groups, making a stop today in Indianapolis to knock Florida's new education standards into specifically how they're going to be teaching slavery to middle schoolers. Take a listen.
Extremists pass book bans to prevent them from learning our true history. Just yesterday in the state of Florida, they decided middle school students will be taught that enslaved people benefited from slavery. They insult us in an attempt to gaslight us, and we will not stand for it.
Florida has tweaked its laws under Governor DeSantis to change the way that issues of race are talked about in schools. She called it out there, criticizing the Florida Republican government for doing so. Again, using the trappings of the official office to make some political points. She's going to be doing that over and over again over the next several weeks at these conferences to boost her numbers, boost awareness of her, and use the vice presidency as the attack dog position it's traditionally been known for.
Yeah, and we're seeing the administration or the Biden campaign start to try to define their potential opponents as well with DeSantis there. Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much for your reporting at the White House. And that does it for us today. You can stream America Decides Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against?
I just worked harder. The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where.
CBS News has been following.